Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
You could subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite download service, and never miss the great content we offer.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Ron Granieri, professor of history in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and podcast editor for the War Room. Since 1978, the International Fellows Program at the Army War College has welcomed representatives of allied militaries to participate in the educational life of the college. International Fellows are full participants in seminars and bring a variety of experiences to enrich the conversations. Over the past 4 decades, over 1,750 international fellows from more than 120 countries have participated in the program. Of that number, 69 have been elevated to the International Fellows Hall of Fame, an honor for those fellows who have achieved the highest rank in their nation's armed forces or who have held an equivalent rank or responsibility in a multinational organization. Our guest today is the 70th and most recent addition to the Hall of Fame, Major General Torgeir Gråtrud, commander of Norwegian Special Forces Command. A native of the municipality of Lørenskog, Norway, he joined the Norwegian Army in 1981, earned his commission in 1986, graduating from the Norwegian Military Academy. Major General Gråtrud joined the Norwegian Special Forces in 1990 and has served in a variety of command and staff positions in the Norwegian Defense Forces, NATO, and in coalition operations. From 2005 to 2008, Major General Gråtrud commanded Norwegian Special Forces contributions in Afghanistan for multiple tours. In 2009, as a colonel, Major General Gråtrud was appointed commander of the Special Forces in the Defense Staff. From 2012 to 2013, he served as a senior Norwegian representative with the U.S. Central Command and the Special Forces Command in Tampa, Florida. Then, he was again commissioned to NATO's Joint Command in Brønnøysund as head of the Planning and Policy Department. In 2016-2017, he was head of the Planning and Operations Department of the Intelligence Service. Among his many decorations, Major General Gråtrud was awarded the St. Olav Medal with Oak Branch for outstanding personal bravery and leadership during combat operations in Afghanistan in 2005 to 2007. He became the first recipient of this medal for actions taken after World War II. Major General Gråtrud has completed the Army Staff and Command course at the Norwegian Defense Staff College and is also a graduate from the Joint Command and Staff course at the Norwegian Defense Forces Staff College in Oslo. Most significant for us today, he graduated in 2009 with a master's degree in strategic studies from the United States Army War College. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
It's delightful to have you here. Welcome back to Carlisle, and congratulations on your induction into the Hall of Fame. I want to start with a basic question, and that is looking back on your experiences at the Army War College. How did you find life as a War College student?
Life was really good.
Really good.
In Pennsylvania and at the War College. And after multiple deployments to Afghanistan, it was really good to have a break and do some reflection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you give any advice to, or what advice would you give to an international fellow coming to Carlisle to be a student at the War College?
First of all, most of the students do have families.
Mm-hmm.
So I think where they're coming from is probably a pretty busy job.
Mm-hmm.
So it's some quality time with the family.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a part of it. And also for international students to learn a bit more about the American culture and how you are running things over here.
Right. When you came to Carlisle, you'd already been in Florida, correct? So you'd seen part of the United States.
Yeah, I've been to Florida many times, of course, because the relationship with US SOCOM in specific is very tight.
Right.
And very important for us.
Right, for sure. As a strategic leader, we talk about here at the War College, we're creating strategic leaders, and now you have ascended to that level. What strategic leaders do you admire most?
I would pick out one in specific that I worked with. and that's General Jim Mattis.
Mm-hmm.
Later Secretary of Defense as well. Well-known man.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what I admired there is his leadership.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one day you could be a strong leader, giving pretty direct and risky orders.
Mm-hmm.
The next day he could serve pizza to the soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think what he did was he managed all the levels,
Mm-hmm.
and also was very well respected from the bottom of the organization to his peers.
Mm-hmm.
So a role model, I would say,
Mm-hmm.
related to leadership.
That ability to relate to everyone, to gain the respect of the organization from top to bottom without sacrificing any of his authority.
Yeah.
Would you say we've had your colleague Major General Kristoffersen on to talk about, for Norwegian officers in particular, the experience of having been an NCO before you become an officer, and certainly before you become a general officer. Do you think that Norwegian officers have a particular appreciation for the relationship between officers and men as a result of that experience?
I think the system we're having, which is not too different to yours,
Mm-hmm.
Is then the point to be concerned about the NCOs,
Mm-hmm.
the soldiers on the ground, and the guys who are really doing the job is important for an officer. And this is going back to the officer education as well.
Mm-hmm.
So for me to have been a private corporal sergeant,
Mm-hmm.
and then I did the military academy. That was very useful experience, I think,
Mm-hmm.
to have been on the bottom of the organization yourself.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It is when you see it at all levels, it does shape your expectations by the time you get to the top, I imagine. I wanted to ask you about your experiences in special forces, if I may. In your role as commander of NORSOCOM, Norwegian Special Forces, how does that shape cooperation with U.S. Special Forces, and does Norway have a particular relationship within this global Special Forces network?
Yeah. There has always been a very tight relationship between U.S. Special Forces or SOF, I would say, and the Norwegian SOF forces as well. And that's going back to the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the OSS had a 99 battalion under their command. That was mainly guys from Minnesota, I mean Norwegian Americans, that knew the area up in Norway. So I think it all started there, and they did a couple of good operations in an occupied Norway. And of course, since then, there has been a very, very tight and great link, especially on the unit level.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, battalion to battalion.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, as we grow into a bigger structure,
Mm-hmm.
The operational level and the strat level has also really got a very good cooperation and relationship.
Mm-hmm. And so this was both within your work within NATO and certainly your experiences in Afghanistan involved that kind of cooperation and networking.
Yeah, and we also stood up, or I was the projects officer for Bill McRaven down in Tampa,
Mm-hmm.
when he stood up his international cell within US SOCOM. So that I was a part of that as well, and that was very interesting. Suddenly, 14 nations were members of US SOCOM.
Really? Yeah. So it was a mini a mini multinational organization there to work that out.
And that was a part of the Global SOF network as well, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important for the U.S. side to have a pretty good insight and situational awareness what's going on in the different regions in the world, and also to synchronize and coordinate different efforts around.
And what about regional cooperation for Norway and its neighbors, Nordics and the Baltic states? The idea that there's cooperation both among NATO members, but even with non-NATO members, like say Sweden and Finland. How does Norway manage its relations regionally?
You know, we're up in the Arctic area. Most of us that you are discussing, and of course Sweden. The cooperation with Sweden, Finland, even if they're not NATO members, is very vital. Is as vital as having good partners within the alliance, because we are sharing borders. We are watching the new normal situation with Russia.
Speaking of neighbors,
yeah, that's also a neighbor, of course.
Right.
So, and we also have the Nordic cooperation, which is a defense cooperation as well.
And you also, as part of your varied experiences, you also participated in UN multinational force in peacekeeping force in Lebanon. And I am curious about how is cooperation within a UN operation different? I assume it is different from working within NATO or working in NATO operation, of course. But how is it different?
Well, you know, that's quite some time ago.
Yeah.
That was late 80s, beginning of the 90s.
So you were a young officer then?
I was, but you know, traditionally, since UN stood up, we have always taken part in UN operations. That started in Kashmir.
Right.
And it went on in Korea, Gaza,
Right.
Palestine. So that was a typical role within the military to send an infantry battalion, for example. But of course, that also changed in the 90s when the UN mandate was proven to be not strong enough in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So since then, it has been more and more coalition operations. Or operations under NATO command. But back in the 80s, we were a relatively bad skilled infantry battalion. But the people were good, but the training was not that good. And the equipment we had was relatively okay. But my reference was a normal infantry battalion back home in Norway. And when you meet up with different nations' battalions from Nepal, from Fiji, from Ghana, the interoperability is just not there.
That's
the
word I was
imagine.
thinking of, right? Even to the point you couldn't even share ammunition for your sidearms.
No, because they had the AK-47s and we have the AG-3 at that time, so that was not easy. However, it worked out pretty well. But remember again, it was a peacekeeping operation.
Right. And that the difference between peacekeeping and warfighting can be vast, and somewhere in between. We've had several guests here talk about peacekeeping operations, and they say there's peacekeeping, there's peacemaking, and then there's war fighting, and it's hard to be able to do all three well.
That's also pretty obvious because you go with your mission and you train with your mission and you do the rehearsal before you are deploying. So you need to tailor your force to the task, right?
Right. If you show up and it's not ready, it's not that easy to change. We've touched on this a little bit, but I do want to ask, right? And knowing what you now know as a senior leader, is there one thing that if you could talk to that young officer in say around 1990 to give him advice on what he should or shouldn't do in his career, Obviously, you did everything absolutely right because you are sitting where you're sitting.
Well,
You don't have to answer that second part if you don't want to.
no, I mean, that's up to others to discuss, of course. But, what I think is important is to do your current job as good as you can. Don't be too focused on the next steps, because then you are not focused on your current job. So that's my advice to younger officers. Or NCOs.
As well. Well, and I am curious that one of the complaints that, or one of the frustrations I know that a lot of young officers, a lot of officers in general will express is they only have a short period of time in any one job before they're transferred to their next one. And that's if they're successful and they're being moved up. Do you think that armies in general should encourage officers to focus on their current job by taking by the way that they manage the amount of time that people are in, the amount of time that they give people before they get moved on to something else? Is that the kind of thing that a general officer should think about to help junior officers focus on the job at hand?
Yeah, I think so. I think you have a good point there, and what is important is that be happy with what you are doing currently. Of course, in that job, you want to achieve something.
Right.
And if you have 1 year only, you feel that this is a rush. If you have 3 years, because the first year you do the situational understanding.
Right.
Next year, you are deciding what to decide. And last year, you are taking some calls. If you don't have enough time there, you may take the wrong calls. So in the Norwegian system, and my sub-commanders, the normal time is also from 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
However, I always want them to stay for 3 years. Because then you don't have a rush, and then you are doing better decisions, I think.
That's that if you send that message that people know when they come and they join your staff, they know that they can plan on, assuming they're doing their job well enough to keep it. Right.
Yeah, and some other guys they think they have a lot of, or sorry, they think they have little time, Then I'm telling, take it easy. You have a lot of time, and if needed, I'll extend you for another year, because you need to have this experience on this level before you are moving up to the next level.
Right. What's your typical day like? You've been commander of Special Forces for 2 years.
Yeah.
And assuming that there is anything like a typical day for a commander of Special Forces, what's a typical day like?
A typical day is your calendar is full.
You wake up in the morning and you're handed a full calendar.
There is no white space. And you think you are going to different meetings. Suddenly, somebody is changing your schedule. And then you will Rolex some of the meetings to the next day.
So to fill that already full calendar.
And it's a lot of traveling, of course.
Of course.
Over to here, to different nations in Europe, 2 areas where I have people deployed. So I think what I'm wrestling with is having enough time at office.
Because the office work doesn't go away when you're not there. It's just waiting for you when you come back.
The inbox is growing when you're away.
Do you? Is there a moment in an officer's career where you think there is the sweet spot between the responsibilities placed upon you and the time that you have to actually accomplish those responsibilities? Is there a moment you look back on and you say, that job I really felt like the balance was right? Or is it simply a matter of an ambitious officer is always going to feel like there is so much more to do than he or she has time to do?
I think what we are lacking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also going all the way down in my organization, down to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
It's enough time.
There's enough time.
That's the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, well, as I see it, in the special forces,
Mm-hmm.
you want to be really good in what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you need to find the middle ground.
Mm-hmm.
And to find the middle ground, that's tricky.
Yeah. Because you never want to tell anybody, this isn't important. You don't have to do it, right? You want to do everything well.
True. And that's coming back to priorities.
Mm-hmm.
You need to set priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And you should try to follow them.
And so your job at the top, right, is to set the priorities further down, but then each individual, I think if we think of this in terms of mission command, right, every individual officer has to figure out how they can best fulfill the responsibilities placed on them and the priorities set by the boss.
And sometimes you just need to sit down and reflect and tell yourself, okay, I'm not done with this.
Mm-hmm.
But so what? The world will be okay tomorrow as well.
See, it's an interesting choice. Do you try to, assuming we're not talking about a crisis, but in a typical day in headquarters, do you try to enforce quitting time for officers to encourage work-life balance for them to go home to their families?
Yeah. Especially when, not every day is a crisis.
Right.
So it's important to take care of the families, of course,
mm-hmm.
to
mm-hmm.
take care of your friends,
Mm-hmm.
to one day walk out of the office at 3:00,
Mm-hmm.
not 9.
Not.
So sometimes I even order people out of the office.
Uh-huh.
Then they're telling, boss, you're still there. Yeah. Forget that. But now I'm speaking about you. Go home.
So that's leadership, right? To tell people what they.
Yeah, leadership is, in my head, everything.
Mm-hmm. What, in your experiences with the Army colonels and their equivalents, so since your experience at the War College, what do you think separates the best colonels that you've met from the others?
I think that also depends what kind of position they are in.
Okay.
Typical command jobs, then the answer is pretty easy.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have those that are taking really good care of their soldiers
Mm-hmm.
and operators,
Mm-hmm.
and those that are more concerned about their own career.
Mm-hmm.
Which the first part is, of course, the right answer.
Right.
So, and then you need to give them advice.
Mm-hmm.
And some are born with good leadership genes, and some are not. But you can also train this, of course,
Mm-hmm.
to a certain point.
Right. What's the hardest thing about being a general?
It's a lot of fun things, of course.
Yeah.
But the hardest thing,
Having you sit for podcast interviews, I'm sure is right up there.
yeah, the hardest thing is that you're having more tasks than you're able to fulfill. I think
Mm-hmm.
the time dilemma,
Mm-hmm.
and also the opportunity to go out and see the troops,
Mm-hmm.
because you're dragged in all kinds of directions.
Right.
One day it's you're a part of the leadership meeting with the chief of defense. The next day you're at the shooting range speaking to the new operators,
Mm-hmm.
which is also a fun thing, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But personally, I should want to have more time with the latter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And yet, that big fat schedule that they hand you, there's an awful lot of meetings that are far from meeting with the troops, because that's just the matter. That's just the nature of the job.
That's correct. When and of course, then you need to do the priorities as well.
Mm-hmm.
I.e., we just work with the white paper for the next 8 years. That's important stuff, and that's the future of the whole organization. So you better be ready and you better take part in those meetings.
And how would you, at your level, you're of course, most of your meetings are with fellow uniformed officers, but you also have to interact with the civilian leadership. And how often do you, as Special Forces Commander, meet with, say, the Ministry of Defense or with other civilian leaders within Norway?
Regularly, I would say. That's also going with our location. We're located in Oslo, the capital. As a strategic force, we have a short way to speak to the minister. If needed, through the Chief of Defense, of course, and also with the other agencies, like the police, Intel Service, Custom, Homeland Security. So that's very often.
We're almost out of time. I want to ask you one last kind of big question, and that is, how do you envision Norway's role within NATO? Does Norway consider itself a leading state within NATO? Does Norway consider itself a good partner, because it is a good partner? But how does a state the size and shape and heft of Norway conceive of its place within the alliance?
Our strategic location up in the Arctic, and also above the Arctic Circle.
Indeed.
Tells something about the focus, right? And we have a new normal situation with Russia. And I think it's very important for us to be NATO North in Europe. That implies you need to monitor pretty closely what's going on in the Barents Sea and up to the Arctic. And to also share the information that you are finding out. And we're living up there, so we know the situation.
Right.
So I think we have a leading role related to our location and also to winter warfare, for example.
For sure.
I mean, you have heard the story that Norwegians are born with skis on.
I was going to ask, because your hometown is further to the south, so you're not from, but south is a relative term in Norway.
Yeah, it's still snow there.
It still snows there.
So we have some expertise there, and even with all the technology, etc., it's important to be able to survive out in the field.
Right.
So what we see is also a lot of interest from the United States and other allies related to winter warfare. So I think that's important.
Indeed. As a student at the War College, you went on the staff ride to Gettysburg, I am sure. And the Union Army, of course, the far left of the Union Army was anchored by Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine at Little Round Top. Viewed from a particular perspective, right? Norway protects Nato's far left flank there up at the northern flank. So it's a vital position to be in, and it's an important role for Norway to play. And I have to say, so on behalf of all of us here at the War College, we're delighted, General Gråtrud, that you are a representative of NATO's important northern flank. Thank you for everything that you do for your country and for the West. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to everyone out there for listening to this broadcast of A Better Peace. Please send us your comments and thoughts. And we look forward to having you listen in to us again in the future. So until next time, for The War Room, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu, and have a great day.